Hi everyone, good day and welcome to this episode of the POSHpod. My name is Bishen Jeswant, partner at Cyril Amarchand. I work in the employment law practice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laxmi Char, a co-founder at Parity Consulting. And as Bishan likes to keep reminding me, lots of practical experience in the space of preventing sexual harassment. All right. So, Bishan, hot button topic. Objection. Objection, me lord. Objection. The act has a very interesting kind of flow to this whole concept of objection, right? And again, given that we've got a decade of operationalizing this act, how does it play out when a complainant and the alleged perpetrator, the respondent, are told, but once the complaint is received and stuff like that, and they're told, hey, the IC has been constituted, these are the members of the IC, and on such and such a date, please, log into this particular link or arrive at this particular meeting room, and we will begin the process of investigation. Is it possible for either of them to say, hey, I don't trust that particular person in the IC, I don't want them there? Can I
Absolutely.
object?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because
Okay.
as we discussed in one of the other episodes this season, one of the principles of natural justice and which are the principles to be followed when there is any internal investigation inquiry, whether it's for POSH or any other kind of misconduct, right? One of those principles is to ensure that the adjudicating body is free and fair. So that's a right that the parties have. So ideally, this is an assessment that the internal committee should take in the first place, without waiting for objections from the parties. But to check that there is no conflict of interest, no favoritism, no bias, no relationship between the parties, etc.
Yeah.
But sometimes, despite the IC's best efforts, it's possible that they haven't identified the conflict that allows the members of the IC to recuse themselves or be, offboarded. And in that case, it's possible that one of the parties will raise the objection. And they have a right to do so because, like I said, is one of the principles of natural justice. So when the parties do raise this objection, then the IC should consider it objectively and ensure that the relevant member is then no longer on the internal committee. There may,
Yeah.
of course, often be cases where the members may raise an objection which does not have merit, right? And that may be for reasons that are in good faith or in sometimes in bad faith, the objections that are raised. And so it's not that if the parties raise an objection, automatically the IC member needs to recuse themselves. That's not true. The IC should consider if that objection to remove an IC member has merit, and if it does, the IC should remove the individual from the committee for that investigation. And if not, record in the report finally that there was an objection and the reasons why the person was not removed from the IC despite an objection. So that's the process to be followed. But the short answer is yes, it's possible, but that's not automatic. That in every case there's
Yeah.
an objection, it's an automatic removal.
Yeah, yeah. So very interestingly, Bishan, in one of the earlier seasons, I had actually asked you about conflict of interest, and I learned something at that point in time when you taught me about the public perception of conflict of interest and how an IC needs to deal with that, like you mentioned, on the merits of the case, to be absolutely transparent about why they made the decision that they made, and then separately the possibility that during the investigation, there is some witness or some information that is shared with the complainant, the respondent, and the IC that leads to a conflict of interest. And at that point in time, it is important again, either the person recuses themselves or the IC pauses the investigation and goes forward. That was, by the way, viewers, that was a very, very interesting topic that we talked about. And I will tell you mysteriously in one of our earlier two seasons. So go find it and let us know what you think about it. But the other thing, and really where the power of the objection is in terms of objecting to the report that gets published by the IC. So if you look at the way that the investigation flow is maintained in the POSH Act, there is the receipt of the complaint, there is the entire investigation process, and at the end of the process, the evidence which has been collected by the IC, there is a certain level of assessment and deliberation that the IC goes through before they find. right? Either the validity of the allegation or the invalidity of the allegation. Again, something that you taught me and we kind of covered is that just because the IC finds a particular allegation invalid, it does not mean that it did not happen. It just means that the IC does not have enough information to make that
Yeah.
choice. So at that point, after the deliberations and assessments, something that as a best practice we're beginning to see is that ICs then share that the assessment of the evidence with the complainant and the respondent, and give them an opportunity to maybe add more information, maybe bring in an extra witness. How does the act kind of incorporate that reality into its legal mandate?
Thanks, Lakshmi. But before I address this, because you brought up the previous episode, I just thought of something which I think is worth mentioning here, right? Perceived conflict. So there may be
Yeah.
situations when the parties bring up a conflict issue and the IC deliberates it and decides that there is, in fact, no conflict. But if the IC feels that there could still be a perceived conflict, even if not a real
Mhm.
conflict, there may still be value in those situations to replace an IC member, right? Because, like we say, as lawyers, justice needs to be done. Not only should justice be done, it must seem to be done, right? So even
Yeah.
here, even if you feel there is no conflict, but there is a perceived conflict, the world may see it a certain way because of the relationship between the parties, etc. Always better to change the IC members and ensure that there is no perceived conflict or real conflict. And like you said, Rashmi,
So
yeah, go on, go on.
no, so interesting because I left this mysteriously for our viewers, and you happily expanded on it. And you've been so consistent, Bishen, because this is exactly what you said the last time also
I'm glad.
when we talked about the perception of conflict. So, yay.
glad I've not changed as a person over 2 years.
No.
So coming back to your question on this objection with respect to the findings of the IC. So there is language in the Act, and
Yeah.
as viewers who've been watching the POSHpod over now, I can say the years, would have seen we have generally been trying to address gray areas, and this squarely falls into that bracket of a gray area, right? Not that it needs interpretation because the language is quite clear, but it's an oft forgotten, oft ignored kind of requirement under the POSH Act. Lakshmi, I know that you guys follow it very religiously when you are dealing with complaints, but a number of ICs that I have seen do not, because they're not even aware of this requirement, which is that the findings of the IC before they are finalized must be given to the parties so that they have an opportunity to object to the findings. But this is to be strictly done only when both parties are employees. Don't ask me why that's the case. That's how the law is. I don't entirely agree with why the parties should be given this opportunity only where they're both employees. I would imagine that it should be done even where they're non-employees, the complainant and respondent. And the IC is not prohibited from doing that. You may follow the same principles, whoever the complainant or respondent are. But the requirement under the law is to do it at least where both parties are employees. So at that stage, again, now you may say, isn't that what's happened in the entire course of the inquiry anyway, where they've been given a chance to be heard? What are we now doing right at the very end? Right. So I think the point here is when the parties have been heard in entirety and the IC has its findings in a uh, almost final form, and that's the point at which it's handed over to the parties, complainant and respondent, for their final objections before it is crystallized and frozen. Right. It may
Yeah.
be at this point that the parties read the findings and say, oh, this finding of the IC could easily be rebutted if I presented this email or if I presented that witness, and that would enable the IC to then review those additional bits of evidence and witness testimony as well to make sure that the investigation is complete. Because there could be things that have gotten missed in the process of the investigation, which the parties are only made aware of when they see the actual findings of the IC. So it's basically a last chance for the
Yes.
IC to get their investigation right and for the parties to make their objections there. Yeah, Lakshmi,
And
from the way you handle these complaints at this step of the process, I think there be value in you telling viewers as well how you deal with this step.
yeah, yeah. Well, nothing special. I think it's just a best practice that we are beginning to see more and more ICs following. it starts from understanding from an IC's perspective that just because we have 90 days, it doesn't mean that we have to publish the report on the 89th day, right? It's
True.
always good to keep some time as a backup. So be smart about using the time. And therefore, Bishan, to your point, like before the final recommendations are tabulated into the report, the draft report or the prelim report, as we kind of informally refer to it, is shared with both the complainant and the respondent, exactly to your point, right? So if they have any additional information, we do tell them that, hey, you have 72 hours if you'd like to respond to this. And if we don't hear back from either complainant or respondent within 72 hours, then the IC goes ahead and formalizes and finalizes the report with the recommended actions that need to be taken. Um, what we've seen is that, after that recommended action is implemented, then suddenly somebody says, oh my God, is this what you're going to do to me? No, 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 I object. And at that point in time, we are very clear that as far as the IC is concerned, that door is closed, right?
Yeah.
The act very clearly allows you to object, but you've got to object outside the organization.
Yeah. So onto that stage now, we've moved. One, there was objection we discussed at the start of the investigation process to the IC constitution. Then we discussed objection to the findings in a draft form before they become final. Once they are final, the findings and the recommendations are then handed over to the employer for their implementation of the recommendations. The Act also says at this stage very clearly that the report needs to also be given to the parties. Right? I want to
Correct.
spend a minute or so on discussing this step of the process. This is not an objection stage, but it's necessary for the parties to have the report so that they can object going forward. That's a legally required step. And I'm spending a minute on this because I've seen a lot of employers ask the question, do we really need to give the report to them? Because there is a fear that once the parties have the report in their hands, and as we know, at the end of an investigation process, there is always one party that's upset. The employer is always worried about what will that party do with now the report in their hand. Will they put it on social media? Will it be on mainstream media? Will it get leaked to the press and
Yeah.
to parties who are not involved, ruining the reputation of the company and different individuals, etc. So that's a fear that that employers often have. And the reality is, unfortunately, you can't get around the law. You still have to give the parties, the report. You can, of course, pursue action against them for breach of confidentiality, potentially under the Act if needed later. And I know that's not ideal and is a cumbersome kind of process, but you can't get around the fact that you still have to give the parties this report. What some employers do, and I'm not saying that this is the right way to do it, but for our viewers listening here, from a market practice perspective, a gray area solution could be, instead of giving the full report, you give the parties an abridged version of the report. The abridged version still needs to have the rationale for why the IC arrived at the decision, a logical conclusion, on the findings along with its recommendations. But if there are some extremely sensitive aspects which the IC and the management, would be extremely concerned if it got leaked into a public platform, those could possibly be redacted or excluded in an abridged version, which should still have everything that an party needs to make a representation and objection when appealing in the future. It's an option. I'm not saying it's an entirely kosher option, but it's also not an illegal option. It's in the realm of what's a gray area, right? So putting it out there, I'm not recommending it, but I'm putting it out there as something that is sometimes done and isn't entirely illegal.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the confidentiality because there is an interpretation that the confidentiality clause and the penalties associated with that are applicable only pending the investigation, right, for those 90 days, and then after that everybody's free to go out there and gossip, but that's not true. Legally speaking, there are penalties and consequences to that. But I agree with you in terms of it is vital, and it is principles of natural justice, because at the end of the day, if I am being fired for something, then I need to know exactly what it is that I'm being fired for and why the organization believes that I need to be fired. Because if I want to object, then I need that the entire context, right, to raise that objection. So just to kind of close this out, Bishen, one final question: is there a timeline for the objection? Like, for example, we know that there is a timeline to raise the complaint, but is there a timeline also to raise an objection? Like, if I'm the complainant, and as you very correctly said, I happen to be the party that's unhappy, do I get like a 30-day, 60-day window to go to the court, or can I just go when I deem fit?
Yeah, so we discussed a few different kind of objections. I think for the first two, it's to do it as soon as possible. One, if you have an issue with how the IC is constituted, do it before the investigation process starts so that it's least administratively inconvenient. The second one, the objective findings, I think the IC can set out, a timeline of 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever it is, to object to the findings. The third one, once the report is given in the hand of the parties, then there is a 90-day period within which they can file an appeal. That's the process under law. So there is a timeline for that, and that's I think fairly long and reasonable timeline of 90 days. Yeah.
All right. So, on that note, thank you. I am not going to object to anything that we've discussed on this episode. But viewers, if you have an objection, if you don't have an objection, if you have a question, write to us, talk to us, reach out to us. We'll be happy to engage with you.
Bye everyone. Have a good day.
Bye bye.